Throughout human history, being a woman has usually meant adhering to a list of things you could not or should not do. Now, while some of these restrictions were given with good intentions based on the science and understanding of the day, others were firmly rooted in patriarchal control, regional gender roles, and the religious beliefs of the time. Today in this video, I'll be covering some of the strangest things we used to think women couldn't or shouldn't do, and the ridiculous and often hilarious reasoning behind those rules. While we will be mainly focusing on more recent history in this video, to set the stage we first have to go back to ancient Greece. For Greek physicians, the key to explaining why women were so different from men, both physically and mentally, was the womb. And as such, any ailments or conditions women suffered would be attributed to the womb being out of place. Yes, they literally believed the uterus could move freely around the body. Fortunately though, according to these experts, the womb could be coaxed back into position by pleasant scents. Or if that didn't work, pregnancy was promoted as a fail-safe way to keep the uterus anchored in position. While one would expect such ancient thinking to be corrected as centuries went on, instead the idea that a woman's reproductive organs caused physical ailments, psychological dysfunction, or required special protections and restrictions continued to be a common belief for the next 1900 years. When locomotives were first being developed, some theorized that human physiology was simply not adapted to or capable of withstanding travel at such speeds. It was an understandable concern, as up until that point in history, the only humans that had experienced speeds greater than 50 miles per hour were most likely in the process of falling to their death. These 19th century train alarmists anticipated that the speed would cause passengers to have their eyes permanently damaged while trying to adjust to the motion, they would be shaken unconscious by vibrations, or even render them unable to breathe. Women were thought to be particularly vulnerable, with some doctors predicting that a train's speed would rip out a woman's uterus. Yes, of course, it was the women alone that had the fragile and somehow mobile organs. Obviously, there's nothing exposed that could be susceptible to G-forces that a man would need to worry about, right? While the development of railways connected cities, it is the bicycle that deserves credit for connecting the surrounding villages and towns. In the late 1800s, the bicycle played an important role in liberating women who had previously been dependent on men for transportation. But a lot of the men at the time did not like the idea of women becoming more independent, and as a result, there were many attempts to declare the bicycle dangerous, unhealthy, or immoral. For women only, of course. In an article entitled "Against Nature," the Oregonian newspaper warned, when a girl gets astride of her bicycle, she bids farewell to good looks. If she develops new muscles, be sure some other part will suffer. Some faculty will be slighted, some natural trait will be undeveloped. The New York Journal took it a step further, naming a specific ailment, bicycle hand, and describing it as a permanent deformation of muscles in the hand and fingers that would become as hard as a piece of wood. Unsurprisingly, it was said to be an ailment women are more susceptible to than men. And then we have the Omaha World Herald of June 1897 that claimed bike riding was causing dementia in women. The doctors of France were puzzled by a new mania that is afflicting women who ride bicycles. The feminine cyclists are becoming extremely cruel. Medical men who have made a study of the matter found 17 women who had been seized with the same irrepressible desire to injure all cyclists of their own sex whenever possible. So basically, the first biker gang was made up of women, and they were quick to take out any rival gang members. Nothing abnormal here. There was a young maiden named Grace, once the prettiest girl in the place, but she changed a great deal since she took the wheel, for she now has a bicycle face. Jackson County Banner, February 1895. In a last-ditch effort to make women abandon their bicycle debauchery, men decided to just claim it would make them turn ugly. Overexertion, the upright position on the wheel, and the unconscious effort to maintain one's balance tend to produce a wearied and exhausted bicycle face, noted the Literary Digest in 1895. Other medical works claimed it was characterized by a hard clenched jaw and bulging eyes. Some said it was permanent, others claimed that after giving up riding, a person's bicycle face would eventually subside. Fortunately, bicycle face and other alleged bike-related ailments such as insomnia, heart palpitations, headaches, depression, and of course, reproductive issues were all eventually disproven by more reasonable members of the medical community, and women were free to ride into the 20th century, most likely heading towards a whole new collection of things they weren't allowed to do. As the women's suffrage movement gained momentum at the turn of the century, just claiming that this is how it's always been done wasn't good enough anymore. Society needed to come up with reasons why women were excluded from the democratic process. So, they did. Many academics, doctors, and scientists went on record to say that women shouldn't vote because they literally were not made for it. Yes, the mental exertion could jeopardize reproductive health. Man, this is really turning into a recurring theme, isn't it? Other beliefs of the day included the idea that women simply had inferior brains, which made them unsuited for the mental load of voting. Anti-suffrage cartoons like this one poked fun at women's reasoning abilities, showing that their heads were filled only with letters, puppies, hats, clothes, chocolates, babies, and the faces of handsome suitors. It probably comes as no surprise around the same time women were also banned from serving in court and on juries. The reasons included they were too fragile to hear the details of criminal cases, they would be too sympathetic to accused criminals, and the pounding of the judge's gavel risked dislodging the uterus. Okay, I made that last one up, but at this point, it's almost believable, isn't it? Before the first US astronaut was even selected, the barrier for women was already pre-built and 3 layers deep. Now, of course, it's understandable that early astronauts were taken from the ranks of military test pilots, as these men were already accustomed to flying the most advanced vehicles in the world. And since there were no women test pilots, no women in military aviation, and very few female civilian pilots in general, there wasn't even a need to come up with a reason why women shouldn't be involved in the space program. There was literally none qualified to pick from. But when independent astronaut testing and training started to show that women were capable of handling the same mental and physical loads as a man, the medical community was forced to respond. In a 1964 paper on the topic, physicians wrote, "The intricacies of matching a temperamental, psychophysiological human and the complicated machine are many, and obviously, both need to be ready at the same time." Their reasoning is clear. A menstruating or hormonal woman just wouldn't be able to handle herself in the challenging environment of spaceflight. Even though Russian cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova orbited the Earth for 3 days in 1963, her selection was only so that the USSR could win another space first. And from that point on, both the Russian and American space programs would employ only male astronauts well into the 1970s. When the program finally opened its doors to female trainees in the late 70s, there was still some somewhat legitimate questions that NASA needed answered. They already knew that the cardiovascular system was greatly affected by microgravity, often slowing or reversing the flow of blood. Thus, there were some well-intentioned concerns about the potential abdominal effects longer flights would have on female astronauts. No one wanted to be responsible for the PR disaster of losing a woman in space. But of course, there's a lot of differences between blood circulation and menstruation. So while male engineers were worried about retrograde bleeding, the female astronauts weren't worried at all, preferring to treat it as a non-issue until such time it was proven to be an issue. By the time Sally Ride was set to become the first American woman to go to space in 1983, NASA was making good progress towards gender equality, and Ride has stated that most of her experiences with colleagues and the agency as a whole were positive. But it quickly became obvious that even in '83, the public and press still had a long way to go. No other astronaut was asked questions like these. Will the flight affect your reproductive organs? When things go wrong in the simulator, do you cry? And do you have plans to become a mother? Even Tonight Show host Johnny Carson made jokes at her expense, claiming that the launch was being postponed until Sally could find the purse to match her shoes. But the best story to come from Ride's first trip to space is not one that's chauvinist, condescending, or malicious at all. Instead, it just highlighted how far out of their comfort zone NASA staff were while trying to figure out how to send a woman to space. After showing how tampons would be packed, connected together like a strip of sausages, engineers asked Ride if 100 was the right number for her 7-day flight. Yes, NASA was under the impression Sally Ride's 7 days in space would require 100 tampons. An amount that, if it were any higher, would have likely required a change in Ride's position from flight engineer to payload specialist. The belief that women who displayed aggression or competitiveness could be sterile or transmit unfavorable characteristics to their children goes back hundreds of years. So one may wonder why this is showing up last in my mostly chronological list. The reality is, the idea that women are unfit for sports or certain forms of physical activity is also surprisingly recent. Catherine Switzer, the first woman to officially run the Boston Marathon in 1967, was told by her high school basketball coach, who was also a woman, that women would never play the men's version of basketball because the excessive number of jump balls could displace the uterus. In 2005, while discussing the fact that ski jumping was one of the last Olympic events that still excluded women, International Ski Federation President Jan Franco Casper was quoted as saying, "Don't forget, it's like jumping down from, let's say, about 2 meters on the ground about 1,000 times a year, which seems not to be appropriate for ladies from a medical point of view." He reiterated this again in 2010, stating that the female uterus might burst during landing from a ski jump. Though when the first Olympic women's ski jumping competition was held in Sochi in 2014, surprisingly, there wasn't a single uterus explosion. You know, it only took 1900 years, but I think we're finally starting to realize that this whole wandering womb thing might not be as bad as the Greeks let on. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more weird history, I would like to encourage you to hit that subscribe button and check out some of my other content that is on your screen right now. Also, for those that want to become more involved in the channel, you will find Discord and Patreon links in the description and pinned comment below. My name is Sledge. Thanks for watching.